So this little video is going to be about 50% product review and about 50% technique and advice on shooting underwater. I've recently purchased this very snazzy looking thing, which is a Ewamarine, let me get the name right, U-BXP 100. It's an underwater housing stroke bag that will take a wide variety of cameras. It's got an adapter on the front to take lenses up to 77mm diameter, like this 24-70 here. I've shot underwater probably a couple of times a year, I suppose, in the past 10 years or so, but I've never taken the plunge to buy a full housing, pardon the pun, because a proper housing is a very, very expensive investment. You're looking at £3,000 to £5,000 because each housing has to be perfectly designed around each body, so you can't just get a generic housing. You need to get a housing for a D800, a housing for a D4, and so on. Those housings, however, are fantastic because you can access the controls properly from outside the housing. You're depth proof to 50 odd metres, not that I'm actually a qualified diver, but they are by far and away the best option, which is matched in the price. The other end of the scale, you've got cheap and cheerful stuff you can get for about 50 quid, which are basically just waterproof bags with a sort of slightly more solid front, plastic or glass bit that you can push a lens up against. These things will keep the camera waterproof if you're underwater, but they're frankly impossible to use. Sitting in the middle is something like this, which is kind of best of both worlds, worst of both worlds, if you see what I mean. This comes in at about 350 quid, I think I paid for it. Obviously you haven't got the same level of controls on it as you would have on a full-on housing, but you do have a proper lens mount. You do have some degree of control that you can reach your finger in there to reach the shutter, and it's definitely a better option than the 50 quid job. In my previous experience shooting underwater, I've shot with cheapo little 50 quid jobs and found them impossible. I've used a GoPro underwater several times, and of course it's great, but you can't really see or control it properly. And I have borrowed a full-on underwater housing a couple of times, but with the housing came my mate's, I think it was a EOS 20D, so an 8 million pixel, pretty old camera, but of course that's what fitted in the housing. Has its limitations. The reason I ended up purchasing this is because I had several shoots in a row where I needed to work underwater for a recent Men's Health, Runner's World, Women's Health campaign for Speedo. So obviously lots of underwater stuff to be done. Straight away, one thing to bear in mind with something like this is that because this is a generic bag that takes different camera bodies, it's not specifically matched to one camera body in particular, there are lots of handling issues. It's a bit of a fag to use. Actually getting the camera body in is quite tricky. You have to line everything up perfectly. You have to wedge these little spacers in beneath the camera body, then maneuver it in place so that the lens lines up with the adapter ring on there. Then seal the whole thing up, lock it in place. And once it's inside the bag, here's a really, really important thing. It's very, very hard to adjust anything. You have a tiny little notch in here for your finger so you can reach the shutter, but it's almost impossible to operate the zoom ring, for example. It's very, very hard to adjust any of the dials if you want to change aperture, shutter speed, anything like that. So if you do find yourself having to change things, you'll often find yourself having to take it out the bag each time. This is a pain in the bum, obviously. So that is one big thing to bear in mind when you're only buying a 350 quid thing rather than £3,000 or £4,000. However, the little lens mount ring that goes in there is very, very effective, and it does give you, I think, proper quality images rather than just pressing it up against a bit of clear plastic like you get in the really, really cheapo ones. Moving on to the shoot itself, one other little handling issue that I should point out if you've never shot underwater at all: human beings float, and so do plastic bags. If you've never taken a camera underwater, you'll probably be quite surprised. The first time you do, you have your camera in hand, and there you go, and your goggles on, and you dive underwater, and promptly come floating back up again. You will need some sort of weight belt if you wish to stay underwater for more than a couple of seconds. I ended up basically using a sort of a combination of my old low pro belt with then ballast weights stuck in it, and that allowed me to stay down for a few seconds long enough. This bag has a little inflatable valve there. Now, it's not for inflating, it's for deflating. What you do is once everything's in, you open that, squeeze as much air out of this as possible, and then seal it quickly, because otherwise this just becomes a massive flotation device and you will not get it under the water. For the shots I'm trying to get for this Men's Health Speedo shoot. I want lots of crisp, sharp swimming action. I want that perfect, heroic shot from underwater. Quite lucky that we're at Speedo's headquarters, so I've got the pool at our disposal. I'm not having to work around other people, which makes life quite a lot easier. But because I'm going to be very close in, obviously water, absorbs light a lot. I don't want to be miles away from somebody. I want to be fairly close in, and I want to get lots of them sharp. I'm going to have a small aperture. There's no two ways around that. Having a small, or trying to get to a small aperture, the best way for me to create that is to have an awful lot of light being thrown at it, and of course indoors, that's not really very likely. The best way of doing this, I believe and I think, is to lob an awful lot of flash power at things. Now, straight away, of course, I can't go sticking flashes underwater. So what I've done is I have all 4 of my Pro Photo heads, which are out of the water. That's 2 D1 1000 watt monoblocks and 2 B1 500 watt second battery monoblocks, all of which are on full power. They're giving me then, I think, something like F11, F13 once I'm under the water, because if you've never tried this before, you'll discover that water eats light very, very quickly indeed. You'll be surprised how much, even a couple of feet down, the light gets absorbed. This means I can shoot a nice fast shutter speed and freeze that action properly, and with a nice small aperture I can also get lots of sharpness because I'm pretty close in. There is a catch though. This wonderful little Pro Photo Air trigger, which allows me to adjust things remotely and trigger things remotely, the radio signal from this, which I think is 2.4 gigahertz or some such, will not pass through very much water. In fact, from testing, anything up to about 20 centimetres of water is enough to kill the signal of this. So I can't take this very far underwater. In fact, what I ended up doing was attaching a TTL cable to the to the hot shoe of the camera, and then onto the trigger like that. And then, as you'll see from this detail shot, I ended up taping the trigger to the very top of the underwater bag here. And then as I went under, the trigger was staying very, very near the surface and managing to trigger the flashes. If I dropped even below 20 centimetres below the surface, the flashes weren't firing. So well worth bearing that in mind. Shooting this way is what I call a one-shot deal. It's how I often shoot quite a lot of sports and action stuff, and I promise there'll be more information in a future video about that. But because I've only got one shot, because it takes a second and a half for all these flashes to recycle, I pre-focus on a certain spot, I explain to the person I'm shooting what I want them to be doing as they hit that spot, and then I lie in wait, and as they go past doing whichever motion it might be, snap, take that one shot, and everything should be caught in that one moment. Overall, very, very happy with the results, to be honest, for something that's, in my opinion, as cheap as this, for 350 odd quid. The results are absolutely fantastic. Obviously, a lot of handling issues. It's a bit of a fag to use it and trying to adjust things when you can't really reach in the bag, but you get what you pay for. If I wanted a full control of everything, then I would have to go and get an expensive housing, which is thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds, and given how rarely I shoot underwater work, that simply isn't justified. But for the money, very, very worth it if you're doing occasional once or twice a year underwater work, or even if you're simply in conditions where you think your camera's going to get absolutely soaked. So personally, yeah, highly, highly recommended, but I would suggest, as always with any new equipment, you have a little play around with it first. Don't turn up on the day and expect that it'll work perfectly the first time without a little trial.